The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Quashing Qualia. Hello, everybody. This is a subject I've talked about before in a number of different contexts, but I came up with some answers to questions people had asked, and I thought it'd be worth describing both the confusion that I had long ago and the changing the mind of the kind of creator of a thought problem or a thought experiment. Frank Jackson, when discussing Qualia in, I think it was 1982, early 80s, I think, defined Qualia as certain features of the bodily sensations, especially, but also of certain perceptual experiences, which no amount of purely physical information includes. We'll get back to the specifics of that for those more philosophically minded. Frank was an epiphenomenalist and a dualist, and now he's neither, in part, I think, because of the responses to his thought experiment. Dan Dennett has described Qualia as this ineffable kind of take on human experience. It's similar, but Dan rejects the notion that Qualia exists or is anything in and of itself. And some people have described Qualia as what it's like to see red, to taste peanut butter, this is about the experience, not features or properties of the thing. And that's a point of confusion we'll get back to in a little bit. In Jackson's thought experiment, and it was originally presented as this: Mary is a brilliant scientist who, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and use terms like red, blue, etc. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina and exactly how this produces, via the central nervous system, the contraction of the vocal cords and expulsion of air from the lungs that result in the uttering of the sentence, "The sky is blue." What happens when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Does she learn anything new? It's been whittled down and simplified over the years. Because Jackson's position at the time was that, yes, she does learn something new. My position upon first hearing it was a very simple one that I still think is correct, but didn't require any digging around. And that is, if in fact Mary knows everything there is to know about this, then no, she doesn't learn anything new. What she has is an experience. And so she may not know what it feels like to experience that, but if you define her as knowing that, then she doesn't learn anything new. And so the thought experiment itself defines things in such a narrow way that I don't see how anybody could reasonably argue that if Mary knows everything that about X, that she learned something new about X, no matter what it is. And so what the point was, if Mary only knows the physical things about X, and so if Mary learns something new, it must be non-physical. Okay. Dan Dennett proposed a robo-Mary, a robot version of Mary who can examine the brains of other robots and essentially copy their information. All the physical information, the raw data that some other robot who has seen red put together. And Robo-Mary only has black and white senses, will never be able to actually see red. If she imports all of some other robot's experience, that would be a compilation of the entirety of the physical knowledge that that robot experienced. That robot knows what it's like to see red. And therefore, Mary, or the Robo-Mary, now knows what the other robot knows, including what it's like to see red. And so the attempted solution to this robot Mary thing is to say something like, well, yeah, but you could look at it about, is it in this memory location? As if it only counts when you're actively experiencing it, or when it counts as a referenced memory, and not just, I have had that experience and I'm aware of it. For some people, it may be worth looking at something like Mary's peanut butter instead of Mary's color room, because I know what it's like to eat peanut butter. And can I tell the difference between Skippy, Jif, and Peter Pan? Sometimes, sure. And so even though those are 3 different brands of peanut butter, we know that they taste slightly different. And so if we're trying to just generalize and say, I know what it's like to taste peanut butter, that's true. But do you know what it's like to taste that peanut butter? Do you know what it's like to taste that peanut butter? We have to generalize, because that's how we can determine what peanut butter's supposed to taste like, so that we can determine if there's a bad batch. Or this is not the same. You've done something wrong when you made this. You've made peanut goop, but not peanut butter. Now, the first point of confusion that many have had is that qualia is a property of the item itself. And that somehow this non-physically is transferred to us. Like through nothing physical, or not limited to the physical, some property of the item is transferred to us. That is the completely wrong way to look at qualia. That's not what quality is. Qualia is, if you see a red tomato, the tomato doesn't have qualia that we're talking about. Similarly, the second point of confusion, which is one I shared fairly early on, is that qualia is a property of the property of an item. So qualia is a property of red or cold or sweetness. But first of all, those things, red, cold, and sweetness, should be labeled color, temperature, and taste, because we're already coloring our perception by talking about specifics. Because red is a label we put on a color. Cold is a label we put on certain temperatures. And they are contextual. Is this ice cream cold or cold enough if it's melted? Is it still ice cream if it's not ice? We'll set that aside for today. But the third point of confusion is that there's some value or non-physical essence to your personal experience of things when we're all different. And one thing that might make you laugh makes somebody else cry. Something that you love might be something that someone else hates, both with regard to flavor or color combinations. Apart from evaluating normative descriptions of things in order to spot alterations or aberrations, I suppose, there's very little value for the rest of us in your unshareable personal perceptions. I had this experience last night, but I can't describe it to you. I could maybe come up with some loose approximations, and then we can see if your loose approximations are the same. And this is what people sometimes view as qualia. Neuroscientists are looking at it, trying to find a way to say, oh, here's what qualia is. There's this subjective experience, and we do this and this and this, and we can see, boom. And that's kind of roughly where there's qualia. The language that we use colors our perception of things. And we think about things in terms of, what does that look like? What does that taste like? What does that feel like? And so we're making the item the object, and therefore imbuing it with feeling. It has a feel. It has a visual presentation. It has a taste. That's the normal way we look at it. What's an orange taste like? What's peanut butter taste like? But what Qualia is talking about is not what the orange tastes like, because that is pointing to the orange. It's more about, what does eating this orange taste like to you? How does your brain see a color? How does your brain taste this food? It was the thought experiment of Mary's Color Room was originally about knowledge and physicalism, to show that if we got rid of the physical things, then anything new we learned would have to be non-physical, which means there's something other than the physical, which means physicalism is wrong. Now, physicalism is the notion that essentially the physical world is all there is. And it may or may not be the case, but at least we recognize there is a physical world. If there's something beyond the physical, that has its own burden of proof. And you're not going to get there by just asserting that something is too weird, too spooky, too ineffable to actually be tied to the physical or exclusively physical, that there's something more to it. And it seems that what we're talking about as something more most often is there is the thing and the experience of the thing. And we are so flawed in our understanding of what it's like to actually experience and describe things that it's easier to make it almost seem magical. Now, the creator of that thought experiment was an epiphenomenalist and is now a physicalist. They now reject mind-body dualism. And that might be the most important part of any of this, because some of you heard about Mary's Color experiment before. Some of you have read about Qualia. But for me, one of the most important things is that somebody had some thoughts and did their best to describe them and give them out to other thinkers in that field, to have them be ripped apart, criticized, debated, discussed for ages. Well, all right, decades. And then at some point, they changed their mind on what they thought was happening. That's what we should be doing. A thought experiment discussed for many years, prompted a bunch of thought, helped change the author's mind, helped change and educate many other people's minds, and may have helped clarify how we think and talk about many cognitive issues. Now, for me, in much the same way that I say faith is the excuse people give for believing things when they don't have a good reason, because if you have a good reason, you don't make appeals to faith, Qualia is the label that some folks prefer to use for your internal subjective experiences that are difficult, if not impossible, to convey accurately to others, and which are distinct to a specific experience. Yet the advocates of Qualia will try to expand that specific to the general. You can investigate as to why expanding from the specific to the general might be a problem. But every single person's perception of red or peanut butter is, as far as we can tell, distinct each and every time. Every time you've tasted peanut butter, it's been slightly different. Because you're slightly different, your surroundings are different, the time is different, and the peanut butter is different. Every single time you've seen red or eaten peanut butter, it has been different. And you bank that information away in order to suggest a general rule about what it's like to experience those things. And that's great. Until you try to say that the experience of those things goes beyond the physical and therefore disproves physicalism. Qualia is our attempt to label the flawed generalizations we make about our experiences. When Jackson's definition at the start that I talked about, certain features of the bodily sensations which no amount of physical information includes. Really? What is there about bodily sensations that go beyond the physical? How do you demonstrate that? If we were to map my brain, shut it down, and then install that saved map and restart my brain, do I restart with my memories, my feelings, etc.? Do I restart where I left off? Is it like hitting a pause button and continuing? If not, you need to explain why not, and show that it's the case? And if so, then what room is there left for anything other than the physical? For example, if you were able to save the physical state of the entire universe, every physical element of the universe, just save it in a state, and remove anything that is non-physical, and then load that save state and start the universe, what's the difference? Do we have any way to identify anything that is missing? My intuition is that there wouldn't be a difference. And those who claim that it would be different have adopted a burden of proof, because the default position is that things are going to be the way they are and the way they appear until you demonstrate that there's something else going on. The sort of null hypothesis that there is no connection between qualia and reality is the default position, and you have to show that it is. And I don't just mean qualia as a description. I mean qualia as a non-physical property of our experience. And if we can take that map of the universe and restart it, as it would seem to be the case, obviously we can't do the experiment. And this is why we'll have those discussions. Is there qualia? Well, if you're defining qualia as the label we put on the flawed generalizations about our experience, yes. Is there value in qualia? Well, if you're looking for ways to take specific experience and generalize on them in ways that are potentially helpful in spotting the aberrations, then yeah. Do those types of qualia in any way discount or disprove physicalism? Not at all. Where's the demonstration that our experiences and our interpretation of them ever goes beyond a base physical interaction? It's something that is appealing to many people who are dualists, substance dualists in particular. But how do you demonstrate it? And so I think the thought experiment really not only changed the mind of its creator, but helped many of us get to a better understanding of things. And so when somebody asked me before about qualia, and I just say, oh, I reject qualia, the other lesson is I need to ask them, by qualia, do you mean a non-physical blah, 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 or do you mean the flawed perceptions that we have about our experiences? And then go on to say which one of those I reject and which one of those I accept. In the meantime, do some thinking and go read some thinkers. Figure out what you think. Is there something more beyond the physical? And does this impossible to perform thought experiment do anything to show that that's the case? Because for me, I reject dualism in part because of the failure of this great attempt at defending it. Doesn't prove that it's not true. Doesn't prove that it's true. But I know the physical world exists, and if there's more, it's up to somebody who actually has the information and knows about it to share that with us. That hasn't happened. See you next time. Bye-bye.